On today's episode of the show, I'm going to go over my final 2024 rookie wide receiver rankings, or at least my final rankings before the NFL draft. Once again, the YouTube version of this show is a little bit behind the podcast version, but I am hoping to catch up over the next week, and all the content for me pre-draft should be out before the NFL draft. So with all that said, time to get into my 2024 rookie wide receiver rankings and a little bit more discussion about the wide receiver position, including the Stefon Diggs trade in episode 17. One of the biggest obstacles in evaluation is bias. The only definitive thing you can really say about bias is that if someone tells you with zero hint of nuance that they are not biased at all, that person has either a bias or self-awareness problem, because everybody's biased. Now, this is a football show, this show being Fantasy for Real with myself as host, CJ Friel, but more than most things, this argument about bias does kind of cross over between both football and kind of all things. The conversation about bias is most important here because the Stefon Diggs trade, which involves obviously two major quarterbacks and two very exciting young wide receivers, has bias everywhere. Now, before I get into that a little bit more, I will be diving deep into the rookie wide receiver class for the 2024 draft after this segment, and that section will go on, say, an hour, 80 minutes, something around here, where I cover my top 15 wide receivers. I have another 10 or so honorable mentions, but for this opening, I'm going to discuss, first off, my own biases, because I cannot be unbiased. Now, as someone who does do self-evaluations, at least in some ways, I've never found myself particularly biased by my fandoms, the Bears, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Neither of these things I've really felt pulled to. I've never had particularly, and that I mean that positively and negatively, I've never had particularly high grades on the players from teams I love. I've never had particularly low grades on teams from players I hate. I have avoided drafting Packers before, but that's kind of a different thing. I wouldn't actually rank them below on something I'm recommending to somebody else. That said, if there is a way that I'm biased in kind of a very similar way to a lot of people out there, I'm biased in the sense that things I say and believe, I really want to come true. And so for me, myself, I have to acknowledge this, because anyone who listens to this show knows that I love Nico Collins. And to be clear, there's been times in the past where I've loved a player, the price has spiked, and I've been like, wow, that's too rich for my blood, I need to sell right now. But Nico Collins to me has been basically the exception to that rule, a player that I've constantly outpaced the market and been ahead of where they've felt about the player. And so while I'll do as good of a job as I can to break down every element of this situation, I have to start out by acknowledging this, because otherwise I don't want it to sound like every time I say something positive on one side or negative on the other, that's something that just has to be kind of skipped through because you can't trust what's being said. So my bottom line, just to start before I even get into this section about the Diggs trade, is that, I'm glad that I'm doing only weekly right now, at least for this news segment, as I'm doing these ranking shows, because it's given me a little bit more time to look at all the reactions. And the one thing that's shown clear to me with all the reactions to the Diggs trade is that almost all of them are too confident. You should not know how this situation is going to break down. You should not know how this target share is going to break down. And if you feel like you know how this target share is going to break down, then you're maybe verging on being the person I talked about in the first line that says, I am unbiased, because there's no way that you can have that much confidence in what's going to go down in Houston next year. So as we get into this predictive portion of the show about this segment, talking about the Diggs trade, again, it's important to note that my goal here is going to be to show the outcomes. At the end of the day, we have to price the outcomes. So I'm going to choose outcomes that I think are more likely than the others as well. But confidence level needs to be correctly applied, and we can't just let ourselves run amok with bias. We need to be objective and ground our process as much as possible to look through all these variables as calmly and as clearly as we can, even if we do have bias. Because it's not a bad thing to have bias, it's a bad thing to not acknowledge that we have bias. So getting into this Diggs trade, Stefon Diggs traded to the Houston Texans alongside a 5th and 6th round pick, one of those picks being this year for a 2025 second round pick. It's also important to note right off the top that this would make Stefon Diggs eligible to calculate into the compensatory pick formula for the Houston Texans. Now, I'm just using this disclaimer maybe because I just watched a segment on the Athletic Football Show where Robert Mays and Nate Tice were talking about the fact that we're probably getting to the point where we're maybe overrating compensatory picks right now because they're kind of the new hotness for NFL nerds like me. But it is just worth noting that if Diggs plays with the Texans only this year and then moves on the following year, he would play into the compensatory pick formula. Yes, it's a very theoretical thing, but there's at least a potential possibility within this trade that the Texans get back 3 picks and Stefon Diggs for their 2025 second. Now, again, with all the bias things that I've already been saying, subjectivity comes into all these things, but I do have some takeaways about these day 3 picks because I think a lot of people are brushing past the day 3 picks, and I understand that theory because day 3 picks aren't that valuable, but day 3 picks still say something about the leverage in a trade. The guy who gives up the 4th is usually the guy who wants it to happen a little bit more, or perhaps needs it to happen a little bit more, which might be the case here. And I guess my point is they didn't even avoid sending Diggs to the AFC. They did avoid sending him to the AFC East, but they sent them to one of the most primary contenders in the AFC. While doing this, the Bills also gave up 2 day 3 picks, and the Bills have been operating the last few years off of a deficit, or they're getting into the position to operate off of a deficit because the last several years they've been paying it forward, or whatever you want to call it, paying it back, whatever you want to call it. I'm getting my terms mixed up. The point is they've been overinvesting the last few years, and the bill is coming due right now, and so they need these cheap contracts. And so while I get the fact that some people might think about it like making a mountain out of a molehill, because day 3 picks are molehills, this still suggests to me that an AFC contender was able to look at another AFC contender and say, hey, if you want a second round pick for this player, you're not getting a 2024 second, you're getting a 2025 second, and you're giving us back more if that's what you want to do. And as a contender, as a team that they might face in the AFC divisional or conference championship game, the Bills said, all right, we'll do that one. And the only offers I could see them turning down as opposed to those is if they got offers from the Jets before the Mike Williams deal or the Patriots and they wanted to keep him out of the AFC East, which I at least understand that part, but it really seems like the market was a little bit bearish. It seems to me like Houston was the team that had the leverage despite the fact that they were going after the big name, which is usually the opposite when that happens. So getting into the players themselves, it really starts with CJ Stroud because it's important to note that pocket passers have pros and cons for fantasy football, or rather them themselves for their own scoring have some cons, but for the wide receivers, they have some pros. Because the most underrated statistic, at least if you play in any kind of half PPR or full PPR, which almost everybody does at this point, is completions. Completions directly translate to half PPR and PPR volume. Quarterbacks who have carries, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns are far less likely to have high completion numbers, let alone passing yards and passing touchdowns. So for every reason you hear somebody say CJ Stroud has some high upside now in terms of like being a perennial top 3 player on a redraft basis, all of those reasons create a volume for this Texans passing game where it is theoretically possible you're fairly satisfied with the season of all 3 of these players at market price. When it comes to Diggs himself, and really when it comes to all 3 of these players, I think a lot of the market that I've seen, or a lot of the reaction I've seen, suggests that this kind of lowers the ceiling a little bit. And the real thing to me that's happening here is that the ceiling and the floor have become far more volatile for all 3 of these players, starting with Stefon Diggs. Because while Stefon Diggs was in a situation where he had a very bad back half of the season, whether you blame that on Diggs, whether you blame that on Joe Brady, that doesn't matter. It's a fact that he had a poor statistical back half of last year. I would argue it's still, or should still, be considered a more stable environment, especially for players getting towards the age of 31, to be with the same quarterback you've been with for the last 5 years and in the seasons that were the best in your 9-year career. I think that's a very important point to make with Diggs just right off the bat, is that we always think about players and their performances in terms of production as exactly what the same thing, like as a one-to-one sometimes. Not necessarily exactly like that, but I guess what I'm getting at is that at least I, myself, would argue that the performance itself of Stefon Diggs in the Minnesota Vikings years was not that much different than the Buffalo Bills years. Yet in every single season he played with the Buffalo Bills, he had more receptions and receiving yards than his Minnesota career highs. He was also far more stable in touchdowns with 8 every single season. I think it's really tricky to get into the motivations of players because Stefon Diggs just got a chip put on his shoulder, you could argue. And Stefon Diggs is one of the last players you want to put a chip on his shoulder. At the same time, we have seen this song and dance before, and we have seen it go poorly, and go poorly a little early. This is a player who, under no uncertain terms, probably at least in part, left both of his last 2 organizations because there was a development of a problem with the off-field communication, or there are off-field issues that have caused Stefon Diggs, in part, to leave both of his last 2 teams. Despite the fact that he hasn't, done anything bad. I guess that's probably my big fear with this. Because when I say off-field, or when I imply off-field, it always sounds like he's doing something bad. Stefon Diggs hasn't done anything. He hasn't done anything bad. He has made a tweet recently that suggested he might be the only reason Josh Allen's good. So that's something. And that's probably part of the reason that he's not in Buffalo anymore. Not necessarily the tweet, but all the relationships between Buffalo and Stefon Diggs. So to me, the safer choice would have been to stay in Buffalo. Even if the Joe Brady system wasn't a perfect fit, I would have felt like that was probably the safer decision. Now on his 3rd team, heading into year 31, the floor is there. And when you are 31, when you head towards your floor, you really don't head towards your floor. You just kind of hit it. You hit it really, really quickly. At the same time, I think the chip on the shoulder is really the narrative way, at least, that you would describe how Diggs could be incredible this year, because he will be very motivated, you have to feel like, to prove some things in a 3rd environment this time. And then obviously they are different variables, but I think the same things are generally true for Nico Collins and Tank Dell when it comes to how, yes, you could make the argument, and I do think there's at least a chance that everybody's ceiling just gets pushed down a little bit. But I think in reality, there's also a big chance that the floor and ceiling potentials, particularly from dynasty value, just went way to different sides when it comes to Nico and Tank. By which I just mean, we'll start with Nico and we'll start with the negatives there. If Nico Collins, who's a guy who's never generated targets the way Stefon Diggs does, he has been incredibly efficient. He's been one of the most efficient receivers basically ever, based on last year's tape or last year's production. But even last year, even adjusting for the missed games, Nico Collins wasn't a huge target hog the way that some other players, especially players who are producing like that, become huge target hogs. Stefon Diggs is that huge target hog, and so if Nico Collins' target numbers go significantly lower than they've already been throughout his career, even if he is efficient, that at least has potential to send his value very, very far down and start to generate this conversation about why he's not generating targets a little bit more seriously. That said, I think people are also kind of underrating how Stefon Diggs being a point of comparison gives Nico Collins a bridge to be a true wide receiver 1 in Dynasty. And to be clear, he probably already had the potential by just having another good year. But 31 years old or not, if Nico Collins and Stefon Diggs even say go tit for tat, even if Nico Collins doesn't outplay it, let's just set that one aside. Diggs has a great game, then Nico has a great game, then Diggs has a greting game, then Nico has a great game. I'm just setting Dell aside for a second. That's going to be something that can immediately boost Nico Collins' reputation and establishment way up into the range where when you combine the ceiling that Nico Collins has already proven with CJ Stroud and then add establishment, that's something that could actually push him into the range that people think is a little crazy right now for a player like Nico Collins. And then for Tank Dell, now I think there's 2 real schools of thought with Tank Dell and Nico Collins. I don't want to go into this conversation too deep right now, but you see a lot of people compare Tank Dell and Nico Collins in the game that they both played, and there's some things that slant to Tank Dell. I completely understand that. My thing is that I believe that all wide receivers get proven through the combination of efficiency and volume, and right now, Tank Dell does not have volume. I have made the case before that Nico Collins' 10 games in 2022 was a little bit underrated, specifically when you put it into context. It was pretty solid on a per route basis. It was pretty solid if you adjust 10 games to 17 games because he was injured for half the season. And so when you put together Nico Collins' 10 games in 2022, Nico Collins' 14 or 15 games in 2023, you can even throw in the 2 postseason games in 2023, you get a sample at this point, which is say 25, 27 games long, where you put it together and the overall numbers are great, the efficiency is fantastic, and even the downsides early on in the sample have at least some positive signs, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, and particularly with the idea that the quarterback situation wasn't just worse than CJ Stroud, but pretty bad in that 2022 season. On the Tank Dell side of things, there's no way you can give him 20 games. He doesn't have 20 games. He has whatever he has, 10 games. And I'm just not willing to view those as the same thing, even if in those 10 games, there are little indications that Tank Dell might be preferred. While I struggled to find a historical comparison to the incredible efficiency that Nico Collins had that then fell off, I think Tank Dell is actually fairly similar to Elijah Moore in both the way that we receive his first season and how it went. You could definitely argue that Tank Dell's production was proportionally better than Elijah Moore's and significantly better than Elijah Moore's, and that's very fair. You could also argue that Moore's number 2 pick at quarterback was Zach Wilson, and that's very fair too. I could at least definitely make the argument that having a 175 yards per route run with Zach Wilson is more impressive than Tank Dell having an over 2 yards per route run on a team where Nico Collins has 3 and Noah Brown has almost 2. So to be clear, I have Tank Dell in a league. I am not all hands on deck to sell Tank Dell. That's not it at all. And especially now, I'm actually in the buy category. My point is, I did have questions coming into this process. And so those are still kind of the things I'm the most focused on. Because leading me into my next section, leading me into the 2024 wide receivers, one of the conversations we have with prospects a lot is talent versus situation. For draft prospects on this show, I'm covering talent versus situation a little bit more on draft week. But I guess my point is, in concept, the conflict between talent versus situation, everyone always focuses on what's predictive, right? Putting players in the right situations to grow. To me, a very underrated portion of talent versus situation is what we can actually measure, because even if you believe that, say, a certain player is more talented than another player, well, as long as they're not wildly different, how confident should you be in that? And then if one situation is very clearly different by several objective factors and then very clearly different between another one, at that point, should you still bank on a talent grade? To me, I don't bank on talent grades, specifically outside like my top 5, 6, 7 wide receivers, almost ever, especially within that tier, right? As we'll get into in a little bit. My tier 3, even though I break it up a little bit, goes from wide receiver 8 to wide receiver 15. I'm pretty willing to move almost anyone around that tier based on situation, as long as it's in that tier. And my point in saying that is is because the level of confidence I have in ranking one wide receiver, 8 versus 10, or 10 versus 12, or 10 versus 15, that confidence is a question. I should question myself on how confident I should be in my own grades. But in this specific situation, we've seen things on NFL fields from Nico Collins and Tank Dell. So talent is the most important, talent is the most predictive, and we've already seen the good things. So if we've already seen the good things and we already know the talent's there, that's the situation more than with prospects that you should be betting in talent over situation. To compare it to a slightly different situation, I still like Jackson Smith-Njigba. I still have some confidence, but we have no fundamental proof that Jackson Smith-Njigba right now can be who we wanted him to be. To me, Jason looked like a clear perennial 1,000-yard receiver at the NFL level, and he's proven some things. I don't think anyone thinks he's going to be awful, but I don't think he's proven to be that yet, clearly. And I guess my point is, if instead of what we have from JSN, we had, say, a season before this, where instead of at Ohio State with the Seattle Seahawks, he had a really high-level, efficient season, and then they brought in DK Metcalf afterward. I'm just talking theoreticals. We would still have more confidence now in what JSN could do, even if he got held down this past year, because of what we'd seen before. So taking that to Nico Collins, taking that to Tank Dell, taking that to two players who both have at least 5 full NFL seasons before the season that they will be 30 years old. For players like that, I want to back the talent grades over this situation more than in the prospect situation. So for me, that is why, more than anything, Nico Collins and Tank Dell are buys for me. I would still buy them at the exact price they were before the Diggs trade. So if anyone is dropping their prices because of the Diggs trade, I would go out and buy them. On the Diggs side of things, I don't necessarily know that I would call him sell. I always try to put people into buy, sell. And I don't think Diggs is a buy for me because I just fundamentally don't like to target players where I see within their range of outcomes a high percentage chance, relatively speaking, of them hitting a true zero outcome. And Diggs, being 31 years old, being on his third team, being with some of the situational things that caused the conflict for him to leave, to me, Diggs is a player that does have risk of the bottom falling out. And so given the fact that no one is going to sell Diggs for cheap, those are the assets I don't really love to acquire, me personally. But on the same time, I mean, there is a ton of upside here, and it could be the piece to put you over the top. Generally speaking, I would consider Diggs a hold. I think he's probably fairly valued between the risks and the rewards. And so that is all I have for the Houston Texans wide receiver room. I'll take a quick break and then go to some younger wide receivers, some 2024 rookie wide receivers, my rookie wide receivers ranking going 1 through 15, and then doing about 10 or so honorable mentions right after this. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me today on the Fantasy for Real podcast. If you have not yet subscribed or followed the show on whatever podcasting app you use, I would like to encourage you to do so. It is a free and easy way to support the growth of this channel. I do have a lot of stuff coming up for the NFL draft. I will be very busy with a lot of this stuff coming up for the NFL draft, and I'm excited for what we're about to get into. So with that said, again, please subscribe to the show, and I'm about to get into some 2024 rookie wide receivers. So just like last week, this is a wide receiver rankings show, but it's going to turn into more of a positional breakdown for the rookie class. It is going to have some of the same things I've said on previous shows. It is going to have some shorter versions of things I've said in breakdown shows for some of these prospects. But ultimately, today I'm going to cover my top 15 wide receivers at the very least, with some honorable mention names in there. And when I say some, I mean like, say, 10 or 12. So a good number of prospects. When the running back ranking started, I talked about a traits-driven position. For the quarterbacks, the focus was mainly the mix between the two, and while with each and every one of these positions, both of these things are important, wide receiver is the most statistical or production or analytically driven position of the three. I think the main reason for this is that at wide receiver, you prove things a little bit more by earning targets, and targets are earned in a way that it's just different than carries and quarterback snaps. To be clear, like, obviously coaches are almost always going to get it right, but it just is a different environment and marketplace, and so that's just my logical reason for why production matters the most at this specific position. Now, there are some specific thresholds a lot of people look for when it comes to production, and these might come up for me as well time to time. But for the most part, this show's methodology does not focus specifically on the thresholds as much as the idea behind the threshold. The idea that early production is important. The idea that proportional production is important. The idea that proving things at higher levels of competition is important. The idea that grading things by route is also important. More and more, we're learning all kinds of these things, specifically the production, early production, are pretty important when projecting these wide receivers to the next level, and so that's just something to monitor and keep in mind as we evaluate rookies. Conceptually, does it seem a little bit flawed to hold someone's 18 and 19-year-old performances against them so long? Yes, kind of. But if you're being objective, it is mostly the logical thing to do, at least more times than not. For proportional production, the total passing volume is too variable in college football. We already deal with fairly variable conditions in the NFL. But it's nothing like what we deal with in college football. In college football, we have situations where teams are not just wildly different, not just wildly different from schemes, not just wildly different from pace, but also teams that play 12 games as opposed to 15 or 16 games, as the postseason and regular season aren't separated on most typical stat sheets. A number of other specific statistics have also shown to be valuable when evaluating the position, like yards per route run or success for zone. So these are things that at least might come up or conceptually might be suggested as important for one player or another. When it comes to traits, and I've talked about this a few times on the show before, but I think most traits fall under two major umbrella categories for me. The first being separation, and the second being point of attack. I favor separation. I think most people favor separation, but sometimes I wonder if the market has gone too far. Sometimes I wonder if separation, and particularly the idea of high upside separation, gets a little bit overrated compared to point of attack things, which are still very important even in the modern NFL at this position. In general, separation does include route running, but it's not limited to route running because so many physical things also are involved with your ability to separate, not just your overall size and speed, but your ability to change direction, to accelerate and decelerate. These are all at least potential things that play into your ability to separate. And then from point of attack, the way you play from the release point, the way you play at the catch point, the way you sometimes break tackles and extend plays that way. There are several different things to look at with the point of attack. But the bottom line is I believe that most traits you're looking for in a wide receiver go through one or the other. And having traits from both sides is ideal for wide receivers. I think it's also important to note in today's day and age of wide receiver that I think sometimes we get too archetypal, which kind of builds on that conversation as well. Sometimes people just still answer the question of one wide receiver or another with this wide receiver has more upside than that wide receiver physically. And at this point, I really have to ask, why does that wide receiver have more upside physically? There's definitely different things physical, and there's definitely different ideals. And I also think that bigger players are more likely to stick around if they're just solid, for example. But more and more, the top end of this position over the last 5, 10, 15 years has been made up of all kinds of body types, sizes, speeds, abilities. And so frankly, I just think trying to shoehorn upside into any specific archetype or not into any specific archetype is in itself just kind of a flawed practice. At this point, the only wide receivers that I don't believe have genuine high upside are the same ones that I genuinely don't believe have a very high chance of making it at all at the NFL level. Finally, one of the last points I made in the running back section when I was doing this was that running back draft capital is probably a higher hit rate than a lot of people still associate it with. Wide receiver is pretty much the exact opposite. Now, the first 10, the first 15 picks, those players are fairly safe, and both because I grade the top 3 there myself, and because I expect the top 3 to go in those top 10, top 15 picks, I feel very safe about those 3, but later first round picks have been very overrated, I believe, going into drafts by fantasy managers. Later first round picks have missed a very high percentage of the time, and even some of the non-misses are still your mediocre, say, Hollywood Brown level hits, which again, Hollywood Brown, great opportunity this year with the Kansas City Chiefs, but 5 years into his career and his best season is 8 or 9 yards away from not hitting 4 digits. So while when wide receivers hit, they're very much more valuable than running backs, both because of longevity and because of some of the injury risks associated, not just in reality, but in the market. It is important to note that from a talent perspective, the chance that you get a Kadarius Toney, a Jahan Dotson, kind of who's in the middle right now, or Rashad Bateman, a Treylon Burks, who's probably sliding out of the middle right now. All these players, Quentin Johnston, who a lot of people have lost faith in already. Your chances of getting one of these players that stays healthy and plays football and everyone's watching and just goes, oh, that guy's actually not very good, that's a lot higher at wide receiver than at running back. And I think that's an important dynamic to remember, particularly as good running backs getting injured has frustrated the market so much, because at least you still have a good player when you have a injured running back that has high upside, like, say, the frustrating years of Jonathan Taylor. At least you still have Jonathan Taylor. So I think that's an important thing to note here is that not talking about the top three, but basically everybody outside the top three, even players like Brian Thomas Jr., for example, who's been in pretty much every mock draft I see. If Brian Thomas Jr. does go in the first round, but it's in the later first round, that's not actually a very safe feeling to me. That's a high upside feeling to me, especially with the rest of his traits, but it's not a safe feeling. So with all that squared away, let's get into the wide receivers themselves. The running back show was a lot longer than the quarterback show because it focused on more players, and there's way more players to cover at wide receiver. Specifically, there's 15 players that are going to make my big board, as opposed to just 6 at running back. So that's a huge difference right off the bat. So I'm going to cover those 15 players, and then again, I also have like 10 to 12 honorable mentions. So I want to get through these fairly quickly. So while I haven't actually talked about these big 3 that much on this show, and while I took an opportunity for the first 2 shows to talk about the big players a little bit more in this show, I'm really not going to talk about these top 3 wide receivers that much because they're going to go, in my opinion, in the top 8, 9, 10 picks. They all have combinations of athleticism and production that's really hard to poke too many flaws on. There's really one specific one, and I'll cover that in a second, but there's really nothing at all. And these 3 wide receivers at the top are just incredible players, and I assume most people know who I'm talking about, but I'll start with my wide receiver 1, Marvin Harrison Jr. of Ohio State, 22 years, 1 month, didn't really do any testing, any drills, anything like that, but the fact of the matter is, Marvin Harrison Jr. just simply has a level of rare polish that you do not get to see at a player 6'4". The Ringer does some really funny comparisons to where there'll just be something out of left field sometime that kind of makes you think and it's really intriguing. And the comparison for Marvin Harrison Jr. is, what if Marvin Harrison had a very tall son? Which, Marvin Harrison Jr. is just a very tall version of a player that you usually see that's much smaller. And because of that, I think people are very excited about the upside and the floor with Marvin Harrison Jr. I will also say that you can debate who has the best peak season of the top 3, specifically because Malik Nabers' second season in the SEC was so good with so many explosive plays. But no one in this top 3 or anywhere on this list has a second best season nearly as good as Marvin Harrison Jr.'s second best season. Malik Nabers, Rome Odunze, do they have good second best seasons? Yes, they're not one-year wonders, so don't get anything wrong there. But Marvin Harrison Jr. has 2 seasons that are, this guy deserves to go top 5, top 10. Rome Odunze pretty obviously doesn't, because as much as you want to make all kinds of arguments about Washington, you have to imagine he would have come out last year and been the number 1 wide receiver. And Malik Nabers, obviously a lot younger, and he was very good in 2022, but he was nowhere near as good as Marvin Harrison Jr. in 2022. He was, in the second tier of wide receivers coming into the year. He wasn't like a clear number 2 wide receiver or near the same tier as Marvin Harrison Jr. at the time. So moving into Malik Nabers of LSU, age 21 years, 1 month, did do some testing at his pro day and was elite with his testing at his pro day. I think the one thing that's important to mention physically with Malik Nabers is some people I think said that he was afraid to get on the scale at the combine, and I get that for the number, and the number I believe at the pro day was 199. But to me, weight is always just a number. It is a number that influences how powerful and how strong and all kinds of things about a player, how they play. And it is important, especially in certain areas, to be skeptical in certain very, very low areas. But it's not like he was 170 pounds. We all knew he wasn't going to be that low. And I guess what I'm circling around here is that Malik Nabers' play strength is phenomenal to me for a player his size. And just not even for a player his size. His play strength to me is phenomenal. And I think that's part of the reason he's such a good yak receiver. And so unless he was 170 pounds, I really just have no concerns about the translation there for Malik Nabers. I don't think he's as polished as Marvin Harrison Jr., but he's also almost a full year younger than Marvin Harrison Jr. Marvin Harrison Jr. is by no means old, but he is fairly old for an early declare. Whereas Malik Nabers is one of the youngest prospects, maybe the youngest wide receiver prospect I've ever evaluated in about a 3-year period. And finally, Malik Nabers has the best yak ability of these 3. Didn't really talk about it that much with Harrison Jr., but if there is one thing that Marvin Harrison Jr. is not as great at as some of these other wide receivers on this list, it is breaking tackles specifically as a yak receiver. Obviously, this isn't a big concern for me or really a concern at all, as he's my wide receiver one, but it's important to note that this is an area that Malik Nabers excels at. And then finally in this tier, my wide receiver 3, Rome Odunze of Washington. So Rome Odunze is the only player here who is not an early declare, but he is only 2 months, at least rounded on my age list, older than Marvin Harrison Jr., because once again, Marvin Harrison Jr. is fairly old for being an early declare. Rome Odunze would have been very young for an early declare last year. Now, he didn't declare last year, but here we are a year later, still a very young prospect, and he had a phenomenal 2023. He was dominant as a contested catch wide receiver, and if you're someone who subscribes to the reception perception data, Rome Odunze is one of the first players ever, maybe the first player ever, at least in a long time, to have an all-green reception perception profile, meaning basically he's winning a lot in different kinds of routes successfully. Rome Odunze is also extremely well-rounded generally with a great size-speed combination. So the really only thing you could say about Rome Odunze is that he is by far the worst with early production on this list. Both Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Nabers in their second year were excellent wide receivers. Rome Odunze was not an excellent wide receiver until his third year of college. But again, even though Malik Nabers is the same thing, the fact that Rome Odunze is fairly young for his grade, combined with the fact that his first year was 2020, so COVID-19, all this comes together to make it a little bit excusable. And considering his breakout didn't come at a particularly old age, and the breakout was so spectacular, I'm willing to mostly excuse the fact that on paper, Rome Odunze didn't actually have the best early production. So the bottom line for Tier 1 in general is that all of the top three wide receivers would legitimately be a number one wide receiver candidate in any other class. And realistically, they're a number one wide receiver candidate here too. And, we're not that far removed from 3 wide receivers going in the top 10, but I think even, hindsight, no hindsight, whichever you want to use, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, and even Ja'Marr Chase to an extent, there was more risk in that top 3. Waddle had significant injury issues. A lot of people were bugged by Devontae Smith's build, and even Ja'Marr Chase, we forget about it now, but his junior year was supposed to be COVID 2020, and he sat out that year entirely. So in a lot of ways, Ja'Marr Chase was a one-year wonder. It was his true sophomore year, and again, he sat out after his true sophomore year, so we don't think about him as a one-year wonder. But he essentially was that. So Ja'Marr Chase, even, I think, you could imply a higher degree of risk than Marvin Harrison Jr. When we're comparing them as prospects, I don't think anyone really talks about that, but people were talking about that at the time just because physically, we hadn't seen Ja'Marr Chase play football in a very, very long time. That's just the fact of the matter. And Marvin Harrison Jr., we've seen be excellent very, very recently. So it's a similar top 3 situation. But I see absolutely no reason to believe that the upside is any lower. And the risk, though, seems a lot lower. It seems like these 3 feel safer than those 3. Now, those 3 have been very good. That's not what I'm saying. But all the big risks associated with those players, it doesn't really seem like they're associated with these 3 players. And so that's why these top 3, I think, really are truly special. The combination of that floor, of that ceiling, and I'm very confident at this point they'll all go top 10. Next up, there is no group of wide receivers I struggle more with than the wide receivers ranked between wide receiver 4 and wide receiver 7. Now, if there's one major takeaway I have about this class right now, and it's something I've been trending towards for a while, if anyone wants to pay up for wide receiver 4, I would be more than glad to let them do that. I think wide receivers, maybe the wide receiver 4, the wide receiver 5 off the board, those picks are going to be the more risky picks compared to the reward that they potentially come with. The wide receivers that are going to be picked 7th, 8th, 9th in your draft. I think that's more likely going to be the sweet spot where risk and reward create the function that you want to target more often. Don't get me wrong, more often than not, in a vacuum, you'd rather pick the 4th wide receiver than the 7th. I just think in this class, pretty much everybody outside of the top 3 has enough significant risk that the 4th guy, the 5th guy, they have about as much risk to me in a vacuum or projecting this far out than the 6th guy, 7th guy, 8th guy. And so again, with that in mind, I think my goal would be to probably target a running back in that area or tear down. Tearing down, if I wanted a wide receiver, I think would be my biggest goal if I was around the wide receiver 4 range. All that said, I am going to rank these 4 wide receivers, so I don't have any conviction really about where I'm ranking these four. I do think they all deserve to be between 4 and 7. I've really struggled every single time I put them in an order from 4 to 7. I walk away just feeling like something's wrong or someone's in the wrong place. So I don't feel that confident. I just feel like they're in the right tier, and I'm going to stop rambling and get onto it with A.D. Mitchell, my wide receiver 4. So A.D. Mitchell, 21 years, 11 months as of September 1st, 2024, 6 foot 2.5 inch, 205 pounds with 32 and 3/8 inch arms. A.D. Mitchell also ran a 4.34 40, which was a bit of a surprise. He doesn't seem to necessarily play that fast on tape, and he also showed an 89th percentile vertical jump and a 98th percentile broad jump. So when you really put everything together between size, speed, explosive testing, I think I would have to put A.D. Mitchell as my number 1 combine. I think the only player probably who has a debate with him would be if I went towards Ricky Pearsall, because he also did the 3-cone. I think Ricky Pearsall had a great combine as well for the things that I'm looking for the combine for this game. But I'll get to Pearsall in a bit. Right now, A.D. Mitchell had the kind of combine testing that we really look for, and the real question with A.D. Mitchell is just going to come down to how we grade out his production red flags, because I think the big thing about A.D. Mitchell's production is that he very clearly does not hit any of the thresholds we are looking for, and some of them he doesn't come particularly close to, and that's a very big concern. However, I think there's 2 to 3 things to really point out here with A.D. Mitchell, beginning with the fact that the idea behind using these thresholds is to make sure we're getting wide receivers who were very good in college. And while perhaps the offensive system in part didn't allow him to do those kind of things in college or put up the big numbers, a lot of people who watch college football would tell you that A.D. Mitchell wasn't just a high projectable guy, but was a guy on a game-to-game basis who should be considered a very valuable wide receiver. And we also saw this by the fact that he was used in scoring opportunities so often. It gives you the idea that A.D. Mitchell was consistently a good player for his teams. Now, that's not necessarily an excuse for not hitting the proper thresholds, and we want people to hit the proper thresholds, but the point is that at least part of what we're looking for in those thresholds, A.D. Mitchell's not really a problem there as much as, say, the numbers suggest he is. I think the other thing that really doesn't get mentioned enough is when you're an early declare, you only have 3 years to make an impact, and A.D. Mitchell was primarily injured during his sophomore season. And so you look at that and you say, okay, well, one of the 2 years where he was supposed to be a prominent player, he was held down. And we are increasingly getting closer to excuse territory when we say some of these things with A.D. Mitchell. But it is also important to note that on his team, between the other pass catchers he was around, Xavier Worthy had been with Texas for 3 years. Jatavion Sanders had been with Texas for 3 years. A.D. Mitchell was the only guy who had just arrived that offseason. But at the end of the day with A.D. Mitchell, you're not really trying to excuse the production as much as you're looking at the film and trying to see the special traits, some of which show up in the combine, but really it isn't even the stuff that shows up in the combine. A.D. Mitchell has a very good ability to contort, to move, to adjust his angle, both as a player playing above the rim as a ball catcher, and also as a player trying to get open as a route runner or separator. Now, the issue here is that A.D. Mitchell's not anywhere near consistent in any of these areas. If there is one individual trait for any player on this entire list that is the most controversial, I would argue it is A.D. Mitchell's route running, because you will find scouting reports, especially from just people who write on social media, kind of like myself. You'll see a lot of people on all kinds of ranges with A.D. Mitchell about great route runner, not great route runner. And I think the dynamic there is that he's not a consistent, repeatable route runner yet, but there are times where he snaps back in his movement in such a way that you just look at it and go, okay, that'll work on any corner at any level. Because particularly with his size and ability to play, again, above the rim, if he's able to create separation just with that jerk back movement, that's going to just work if he can do it consistently. That's still the big thing. And then in a similar way, A.D. Mitchell shows a lot of positives at the catch point. His drop percentage overall is very small, but he doesn't necessarily wall off defenders or play aggressively to make the most out of his body size in contested situations. So when you look at the physicality on paper, the ball skills on paper, not just physical things, but the ball skills that he's shown on tape, and then you combine that together with the physicality, you see a wide receiver who should be able to dominate at the point of attack, but we really haven't seen him dominate at the point of attack. We've seen him sometimes shy away from the contact a little bit more. So to me, AD Mitchell is a player who actually probably for an NFL team probably has a higher floor than we're giving him credit for, because I think he's probably a red zone player regardless. He's shown the ability to be a high level upside red zone player on a random down basis at the college level. And players who can score in this most important area, especially as a wide receiver 4 or 5 on a team, are going to make a team. So, part of the reason that AD Mitchell's here for me is because I think more than almost every other player on this list after the top 3, I just see as long as AD Mitchell's head is screwed on straight, that he's going to be a productive player or a player who sticks around for a long time just because of the ability. I think the ability to play sometimes in the red zone is going to translate. What will determine if he can live up to this expectation as a wide receiver 4 is if he can develop the consistency in the route running and or the ability to box out and play up to his size at the catch point. I really don't even think he has to do both. But if he doesn't do either, I don't think there's a huge volume upside at the next level. Up next, this is the player that I'm having the hardest time with. He's also the player I think is going to get drafted the lowest, if I had to guess between these 4. That said, for fantasy purposes, Troy Franklin is my wide receiver 5. Now, I'll get right to the conflict here with Troy Franklin before I even go into some of the specific physicals. To me, upside is more about what we see proven through the kind of same qualities we see in production, like the ability to produce consistently, to sit in zones, and to just use different weapons, tools at a player's disposal to produce big seasons. Now, this is by no means perfect, but I actually think things like size, that actually influences floor a lot more. And I think that's the kind of dynamic I have and the problem I have with Troy Franklin right now. For some fantasy reasons, I'm close to putting him towards wide receiver 4 because I think if Troy Franklin hits, he's maybe the one who's perhaps most likely to be the high upside hit. Because if the things that might hold him down don't hold him down, I think Troy Franklin's a great wide receiver. At the same time, I think the reason that you don't see him in the first round or in the top 50 picks as often is that, and I know things are changing physically at the NFL level with red flags, but I think when you look at AD Mitchell, Keon Coleman, Brian Thomas Jr., you look at 3 players and you say, those guys aren't going to wash out. They might not be good, but 2 or 3 years from now, we're going to still be saying, can you be Nico Collins this year? Can you please be Nico Collins this year? And to me, the thing with Troy Franklin is, and I don't want to confuse or make it sound like it's a bigger chance than I really think it is, but the thing with Troy Franklin is I think he's the player who might show up to camp and it just be like, oh, this might not work. Like, this might not work on a fundamental level. Like, we might need to, say, put him in motion every time that he has a chance to get the ball. Now, I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. I think he's shown really good quickness and feel for the game at the line of scrimmage and at the release point. But it's not just 176 pounds. When we're comparing to Devonta Smith proved a lot of things against SEC corners that we haven't really seen Troy Franklin do. So getting into the numbers themselves real quick, Troy Franklin, my wide receiver 5, 21 years, 7 months, 6'1", 7/8 inch, 31 and 7/8 inch arms. Those are both very good measurements, but again, 176 pounds. Now, he did test in several other things at the combine and did well at everything. 85th percentile vertical, 69th percentile broad jump, 63rd percentile 3-cone. But it's important to note that he also measured with 8 3/4 inch hands, which the sub 9 inch hands is a concern for a player who flashed some drop issues in 2023. Drops aren't the biggest concern, but you always have to consider how often is this player going to win deep. Now, if Troy Franklin can win deep more than anybody else in the NFL, then he's going to be allowed to have some drop issues. But say he's more of a wide receiver 2 type on general talent, well, if he's not breaking the defense and he only has a few of those opportunities a year, he cannot drop 1 or 2 of them a year because that's just not going to work. But ultimately, with Franklin, it is, again, the production that creates the idea that he has upside. Yes, the traits, the ability to run really, really fast. Yes, he only tested a 4.41, but he is a fast on-field player. And not just that speed, but the ability to vary that speed is very good for Troy Franklin. And so I think what we see that translate in the production, and the real highlight of the production is that it increased every single year. More than just the threshold, the idea behind youth production is that this player gets better and better and better as we see them get older and develop and have more feel for the game. The things that we see with Troy Franklin in this area don't feel like flukes because of the way we've steadily seen them get better. Maybe that's a bad interpretation of the information, but right now we have reason to believe that Troy Franklin's really developed his feel for the game. So my bottom line with Franklin is that I do try to get myself in the head of an NFL team and some of the differences that might come with that. Within that perspective, I do see Troy Franklin as having way more risk than A.D. Mitchell and the next two guys on my list that are going to be talked about in a second here, and some of the guys after them as well. But when it comes to the things I value the most for this game, a lot of the things that Troy Franklin has done has told me that the upside, which is really what we're seeking when we're taking a guy fourth at the wide receiver position, it tells me the upside is really high with a player like Troy Franklin. So for that reason, I do have some conflict, I do have some questions, but Troy Franklin ends up my wide receiver 5. Up next, at wide receiver 6, potentially my most controversial grade in terms of a positive grade on this list, Keon Coleman, the wide receiver from Florida State. Now, one thing to note right away with Keon Coleman is one of the younger wide receivers on this entire list. He is the youngest wide receiver of this foursome at 21 years, 3 months as of the recording of this podcast. As of the NFL draft, he will not have turned 21 years old. Keon Coleman is also 6'3", 1/4 inch, 213 pounds with 32 1/8 inch arms. He ran a 4.61 40 and had a 1.54 10 split. So the 4.61 40, not really what you want to hear, but the 1.54 10 split, that's actually a really good number, and a number that at least some people believe correlates much better with wide receiver success at the next level. On top of that, a lot of the next gen data that's come out since the combine has suggested that on various routes and on-field drills, Keon Coleman's speed was top 5 when running the routes. So despite the fact that he doesn't have the separation on film, and we'll get to that in a bit, there are some elements, aside from the 4.61, that do show some good testing speed or some good potential to separate, some separation speed, I guess is what you'd want to call it. On top of that, Keon Coleman had a 79th percentile vertical jump and an 83rd percentile broad jump, so while the 4.61 is the headline, the thing a lot of people talk about, he did very well overall in wide receiver testing. I talked about this just a little bit in the beginning of the wide receiver section, but to me, separation is more important than point of attack, but they are both important things to value a receiver through. And to me, the market might have gone a little bit too far on overvaluing separation at the expense of truly valuing the combination of both and looking at point of attack skills as we truly should. And I guess my point in saying all this is that I do have concerns about Keon Coleman, the separator. I do have concerns about his ability to learn to do some of these things a little bit better. That said, again, at wide receiver, we're looking for upside, and no one in this class is better at playing at the point of attack, in my opinion, in this class. I mean, outside the top 3, I'm always setting aside the top 3, than Keon Coleman. Now, don't get me wrong, even he's not perfectly consistent, but I also think some of his issues statistically with contested catches on paper are the trajectories and angles of the passes being thrown his way. I think at the next level, Keon Coleman is more likely to be able to mesh with a quarterback who can get him the ball. And I've seen some people say something similar, but I think they almost take it too far, where they say like he needs to be with a really good quarterback so that they can unlock the most of him. And I don't really believe that with Keon Coleman, because everyone who gets to the NFL level is a great college quarterback. Everyone who gets to the NFL level and starts is, no offense, better than Jordan Travis. If Jordan Travis proves me wrong and is a great NFL quarterback, I will completely eat crow for that. But by my estimation, even most of the backup quarterbacks at the NFL level are better with arm talent and arm angles than Jordan Travis, and better at getting the ball to players with the right window than Jordan Travis. So while I do even understand the comparison to N'Keal Harry, I think, is a comparable player here. Devontae Parker, I think, is another comparable player who's another step up from that. I also think Dez Bryant and Allen Robinson are comparable players here. But I've never really quite understood why so many people obsess with connecting certain players with certain negative archetypes. Yes, N'Keal Harry was a very bad first-round bust. There's also been a lot of first-round busts since around N'Keal Harry for players that look and play nothing like N'Keal Harry. So I don't really get the N'Keal Harry focus. Perhaps it was just because more people were playing one quarterback back then, and it was a low wide receiver class. The only wide receiver drafted higher was Hollywood Brown at 25th. But it's just kind of wild to me because, I mean, he wasn't even drafted highly in the first round. He was drafted 32nd. 32nd. And people act like there's something like weird about the fact that he busted, or special about the fact that he busted. And I get it. I get it from the standpoint that he also never saw the field really, other than the fact that I guess he kind of was still seeing the field a couple years later when he was like getting swan song opportunities. But N'Keal Harry ain't special. N'Keal Harry is just another one of the dozens of wide receivers who also look like all kinds of different archetypes that bust in the first round. It's also worth noting that Keon Coleman, from a production perspective, is truly underrated when it comes to the sophomore season. Now, I would rather see big numbers even in the low proportional environments, but Keon Coleman played really well for a team that did not throw for a lot of passing yards, and he was in the same passing environment as Jayden Reed and had more receiving yards than Jayden Reed. Now, Jayden Reed, was he dealing with some injuries during the season? Okay, yes, he was. But he still played a good number of games. There's also a dynamic between injury and age here where, yes, Jayden Reed is playing through injury. Jayden Reed's also a 22-year-old fifth year senior rather, and Keon Coleman's 19. So, yeah, it's a pretty big deal that he was pretty good on that team. And ultimately, that's, I think, my thing with Keon Coleman. Not that I think everyone should have him wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6, wide receiver 7, but I can't understand when people are so harsh on Keon Coleman when Brian Thomas Jr. was Keon Coleman's age. He hadn't done anything in college football. When Xavier Legette was Keon Coleman's age, he hadn't done anything in college football. There's a lot of guys on this list that people don't have a problem with who weren't even college household names until they were over 21. And again, Keon Coleman's not 21 until May. So Keon Coleman, one of the best point of attack players in this class, one of the youngest players in this class, and I think some of the separation things can be brought out a little bit of him still. So Keon Coleman, my wide receiver 6, and a player that I'm excited to get at potential discounts if the market keeps saying the things that it's saying about him, because it's right in identifying some of the concerns. I just think it's gone a bit too far. Finally, I do have Brian Thomas Jr. a little bit lower than most people, and he finds himself at my wide receiver 7. I've really gone back and forth with this ranking. He was my wide receiver 7 basically from the moment the class broke. And then with him being the consensus wide receiver 4, or at least the most commonly mock drafted in the first round by experts around the NFL, wide receiver 4 outside the big 3, I've been steadily moving him up and back and forth, and it's been a little hard for me with Brian Thomas Jr. And I'll get to why in a second. I want to go through the physical stuff first. 21 years, 11 months, exact same age to the day as A.D. Mitchell. Brian Thomas Jr. is also 6'2" and 7/8 inch, 209 pounds, 32 3/4 inch arms. He ran a 4.33 40-yard dash, 82nd percentile vertical jump, 79th percentile broad jump. Earlier in the show, I mentioned Ricky Pearsall as a potential better combine than Mitchell, and I didn't bring up Brian Thomas Jr., and that's mostly because I think if someone had to get above Mitchell, they would have had to run the 3-cone. But in general, I would probably put Brian Thomas Jr.'s combine at second to Mitchell's. The thing that's the hardest to me with Brian Thomas Jr., though, is I think it's just about how you dissect the abilities and the skills portrayed during the 2023 season. And that's really hard to focus on because it is a one-year wonder season where you're the second best wide receiver on your team, that everyone agrees on that, and your quarterback wins the Heisman. And he doesn't just win the Heisman by being a great passing quarterback. Frankly, I think both for the college game are probably about the same, but he wins it by adjusting defensive coverages because of how mobile he is. So, for example, one just general issue I have with Brian Thomas Jr.'s production is that he plays outside a lot, but there's a few games where he comes inside, runs a slot fade, gets a 70-yard touchdown, and it's just bam, bam like that. And that's a great thing generally, but at the same time, that's more of a college physicality thing. You just put a huge guy in the slot, made it harder to cover him because you have to focus on both Malik Neighbors and the quarterback's ability to run. And then you just run a go route against a smaller cornerback, and it just works because the guy runs a 4.33 at 6'3". Those are more physical wins. And I think that's the big difference between Coleman and Brian Thomas Jr. to me. And to be clear, just like I rank everyone in this tier very, very closely, I rank these two extremely, extremely closely. But while Brian Thomas Jr.'s physicality seems more translatable to me because of how explosive he is on film, it's not the same thing because Keon Coleman wins with football skills more often, in my opinion. While Brian Thomas Jr. does play the ball generally well and flashes upside at the point of attack, it's more of winning, to me, with his athleticism and physicality compared to a guy like Keon Coleman. And I get why people say that about Keon Coleman, because of the lack of separation. But I think even within a lack of separation, there are still things about playing the ball and the point of attack that are translatable and football skills. The appeal with Brian Thomas Jr. is that he has a little bit of that in both the separation and a little bit of that at the point of attack, but I don't actually think he's there at either one of them yet. And then just to put it on the football field, I think the concern is that in his role in year 2, he was asked to do a bit more of a variety of things, and he was fundamentally very bad in that role. And so then you take it into year 3 and you simplify his concepts a lot more and you give him a lot more just go and drag stuff, and all of a sudden you have this great production, or at least fairly good production. And so I do have some issues with seeing somebody who wins so physically, who was put into a more narrow role, and then the success came both from the physicality and from the ability to utilize himself in that narrow role. That concerns me a bit. Now, not to sound like a broken record, but Brian Thomas Jr. is as close to my wide receiver 3 as Troy Franklin is practically to my wide receiver 3, or A.D. Mitchell is practically to my wide receiver 3. So it's not a big deal that he's down here wide receiver 7 for me. But when I'm just being honest, I think every time I look at my rankings, I get a little nervous and try to move them a bit towards the consensus, and Brian Thomas rises a bit. But every time I do one of these and put them next to each other and put them up against what I value, I just find Brian Thomas Jr. slipping a little bit, both on film and on the way I objectively look at production. So for these reasons, Brian Thomas Jr., explosive upside at both the point of attack, upside as a separator, a lot of good things to go off of, and still a fairly young player that can develop in a lot of these areas. But I do have him at the bottom of this second tier right now as my wide receiver 7. And so that wraps up my wide receiver 4 through 7. I'm handling this tier a little bit differently than I've handled any other tier that I've done so far, just because it's one of the tightest tiers, frankly, I've ever had that goes like 4 deep. Obviously, I've had extremely tight tiers because sometimes a tier is only 2 players, but for a tier to be 4 players and this tight, that's a little rare for my rankings, and it's this tight because all 4 of these players showcase to me a lot of reasons in the traits and the production, not necessarily in the thresholds themselves, but in certain performances at the collegiate level, show both a tantalizing degree of upside and at least the idea that they have traits that might allow them to stick around, get second chances, and be drafted highly, so to give them a little bit of floor as well. As I've said before, and as I said with that tier 4 through 7, I love it when the tiers stay consistent even if the rankings haven't. And while they've never come into the top 7, the next 2 players have been consistent as well. I'm going to call this my tier 3A. Every other player ranked for the rest of this list, from 8 to 15 at the very least, is going to be a part of tier 3, but I'm going to ABC tier 3. So tier 3A, starting with player 8, Ja'Lynn Polk. Ja'Lynn Polk, 22 years, 5 months, as of September 1st, and Ja'Lynn Polk, when it comes to physically and with traits, he's just one of the best box checkers in this class. 6'1" and 3/8 inch, 203 pounds, 31 3/4 inch arms, very solid size, 4'5", 240, not the greatest speed, but very good speed for a 6'1.5", 200-pound wide receiver. He also was 75th in the vertical jump and 88th percentile in the broad jump. And like I've said many times on this episode already, when it comes to separation and point of attack, these are the 2 major categories, and I think why I like Ja'Lynn Polk is that Ja'Lynn Polk checks a lot of boxes in both categories, which not a lot of guys on this list actually do, especially now that we're getting down to it a little bit. Polk is very good off the line compared to a lot of guys in this class, in my opinion, at least at the release point, and he shows very good signs at being strong at the catch point as well. He's flashed a bit of physicality as a YAC receiver, and he also shows things in separation. Again, not the fastest receiver, but specifically when you look at the windows he needs to create with his size and point of attack abilities, he's able to separate enough and use route running and footwork to create pockets of separation that a quarterback can take advantage of. The downside for Ja'Lynn Polk is that the production really isn't that good, and it's specifically not very good for any of the lenses I put it through, by which I mean the early production is very poor in general, and the peak season doesn't look good when you consider the fact that his quarterback threw for 5,000 yards. In general, it's kind of the same thing with A.D. Mitchell when Ja'Lynn Polk goes over 1,100 yards. The biggest concern when guys don't hit production thresholds is that they're not actually that good. Ja'Lynn Polk, I think most people would say, is a very good college player. And so that's why the 1,100 out of 5,000 not really being a great percentage doesn't really bother me too much, but it's important to note that objectively, Ja'Lynn Polk's early production is a big fat stinking red flag, and his peak season is mediocre at best. It certainly doesn't check the box. As much as I was just talking about Ja'Lynn Polk being a box checker physically, I wouldn't even consider his peak season to be a check box if I'm basing it off objective things. Polk did have 2 zeros in bad weather games, so maybe you just hope he plays in a dome and that goes away. I'm not really saying that's the issue. I don't know what the issue was there. But the bottom line for Ja'Lynn Polk is, again, checks a lot of boxes, a lot of things I look for in a wide receiver, has a lot of the traits I look for in a wide receiver, and he kind of just reminds me of kind of like that Robert Woods type wide receiver. And I didn't actually look up how well that one comped physically, but just the kind of player who you're never really looking at as the 1A in an offense ideally, but probably could be the 1A in a lower volume offense, and can play off another player really well as a complementary wide receiver. Next up, again, Tier 3A here, wide receiver 9, Roman Wilson of Michigan. Roman Wilson, 23 years, 2 months as of September 1st. He ran a 4.39 40 at the combine and was 5'10" 3/4 inch, 185 pounds, with an arm length of 30 3/8 inches. I don't know if I've actually gone over my Roman Wilson comparison on the show yet, and he is smaller than this wide receiver, specifically by about 20 pounds is the big one. But Roman Wilson, both in his profile coming out of college and some of the things he does well as a receiver, reminds me a lot of Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin was a 4-year college player who didn't have a whole lot of output and played on Ohio State teams that were really, really good while he wasn't putting up that output. Similarly, Roman Wilson played 4 years on a Michigan team that eventually won the national championship, and the main problem is that he just didn't get that many targets. There are a lot of things I like about Roman Wilson. There's a lot of things I'm about to talk about that I like about Roman Wilson, but since we're talking about the targets, the very first thing you have to know about Roman Wilson is that the target numbers don't look good. It took him 3 years to break through 40 targets, with 39 in year 2 and 37 in year 3, and when he finally did that in year 4, he only had 67. So with 67 as a career high in targets, keeping in mind that's also in about a 15-game season, that's not actually a very good number at all. That said, he's great at the catch point. He has very good, consistent, reliable hands. He's got very good speed, very good quickness, and Michigan specifically ran an uber run-heavy, low-passing volume offense. While J.J. McCarthy is getting a lot of credit for being a very good quarterback prospect, he did not throw, as many people know, for 3,000 passing yards, and 3,000 passing yards, even in college, isn't that many. So Roman Wilson's numbers in terms of yards and touchdowns, when you adjust by proportions, and the proportions I look for, they actually don't look that bad. Now, the yardage you would still like to see be a little bit better, but the first downs and touchdowns are very impressive for Roman Wilson. In fact, 38 of Roman Wilson's 48 receptions in 2023 went for a first down or a touchdown. So the bottom line with Roman Wilson is that he shows excellent ball skills, speed, quickness, and has shown a knack for huge clutch playmaking. Any kind of high volume role for Roman Wilson is a leap of faith, but it's one I'm willing to take at this point at the end of Tier 3A. So switching over now to my Tier 3B, starting with Ladd McConkey, the wide receiver from Georgia, coming in at wide receiver 10. Ladd McConkey is 22 years old, 10 months as of September 1st, and while he is 5'11" and 5/8 inch, I think it's important to note that a lot of the other elements of Ladd McConkey's size do not score very well. Ladd McConkey is only 186 pounds, 30 and 1/4 inch arms, and has 8 and 5/8 inch hands. So while the 5'11 and a half gives you a sense that he's fairly well sized, in general, he's actually a fairly small framed wide receiver with things like the small hands that suggest he might just be a kind of smaller framed wide receiver. Ladd McConkey seems to be a draft darling of many, and I really almost appreciate it, even though I don't love Ladd McConkey myself, because Ladd McConkey has so many of these skills that we have been underrating for so long. Specifically, while we've been looking for wide receivers to always look like worse versions of DK Metcalf, bigger, faster, stronger, the ability to switch up your direction and slow down are probably more important to a wide receiver. I don't know if this is a reaction to Puka Nacua, but you do have to wonder if teams looked at Puka Nacua and say, wait, is that what a project wide receiver should look like? A guy who's decently well-sized, but maybe just has some explosive route running tendencies? And I think that's a good idea in concept, but I think we've gone a little too far here. My biggest issue with the Ladd McConkey discourse is that we call him a high floor, or many people call him a high floor wide receiver, and I think that's a little ridiculous because, this is a guy who's never broken through 800 yards in college. So I do understand it because I think the old school dismissal of a wide receiver like Ladd McConkey would say, well, he's got no upside. He can never be anything that has really good upside, and I don't believe that at all. In fact, probably half the comps I'd put on Ladd McConkey are some of the best wide receivers in the last 10 or 15 years. Guys who separate really well, playing primarily inside with some inside-outside versatility. But an undersized, small arm, small hand, chronically injured, not very productive wide receiver should not be considered a high-floor prospect no matter what trait they're good at, even if it is route running. It's also interesting, I did not intentionally put Roman Wilson next to Ladd McConkey, but I have talked about on the show already how there's some comparisons or really not comparisons here. I don't know if it's because we use some of the same adjectives to describe Georgia and Michigan, and they've both won national championships in the last 3 years, Georgia with 2, but they're not comparable offenses. Michigan's offense runs the ball a ton and plays extremely slow. Georgia's offense passes the ball a ton, puts up huge 50-point games more often, and the real negative is just they spread the ball around a lot. Now, if you want to say that that's a fair argument, or just as fair as an argument, that's fair to an extent. But to me, there is a really big difference between being a roughly 800-yard receiver in a team that's not throwing for 3,000 yards and being a roughly 800 receiver in a 15-game season when your team's throwing for, say, 4,300, 4,500 yards. That's way less excusable for me. So I appreciate all these things about Georgia, but Georgia just plain flat out, in the most simple way to put it, threw the ball too dang much for Ladd McConkey to have so little stats. And to be clear, I do think injury is a big part of this, and I'm really not trying to be too picky either. But I would argue in the last 2 years, the two biggest games, the two highest leverage games that Georgia played in were the semifinal game 2 years ago and the SEC championship this past year, because the national championship game 2 years ago was a blowout, and the Ohio State game was very, very close. And then this year, they didn't make the playoff because they lost to Alabama in the SEC championship game. And in these two games, Ladd McConkey has virtually no stats. Now, he didn't play too many snaps against Alabama specifically, but when you put the two games together, he played about 40 snaps, ran about 40 routes, and he had about 40 yards. Those aren't good numbers. And I guess my problem is the wide receivers we want the most are the wide receivers that make it happen when people are really, really focused on them and trying to keep it from being them. I don't know that we've ever seen Ladd McConkey do that. We've seen Roman Wilson do it. He's done it with all the first down and touchdown things. He's done it by being a more vital part of a receiving game than Ladd McConkey has ever been. I like Ladd McConkey. I don't want anybody to get it misconstrued here. I always have to talk to the market. The market really seems to love this guy, put him near the first round. But at the end of the day, this is the position of proof. That's the whole point of production over traits. This is the position of proof. And what Ladd McConkey's done so far, it's very not proof. It's very theoretical. It's very, this guy stops really well. He stops really well on a dime. Okay, well, he hasn't done that in important situations, in important games, nearly enough. And if we're taking out important games, he just hasn't done it nearly enough in general. So to me, I do see a ton of upside with Ladd McConkey. I see a ton of reason to be excited about the potential of Ladd McConkey. But I'm not trying to be reductionist. An undersized, chronically injured, never had an 800-yard receiving season wide receiver is not a safe bet. I don't care how good of a route runner he is. I don't care how good of an underneath player he projects to be. That is not a safe bet. So, boom bust player, Ladd McConkey. Up next, and no, I did not forget about these players, my wide receiver 11, Xavier Worthy, the fastest man alive from Texas. Xavier Worthy will be 21 years 4 months as of September 1st, making him one of the younger wide receivers on this list and that I have evaluated. Xavier Worthy measured in at 5'11" and 1/4 inch and 31 1/8 inch arms, which are very good length measurements for a fast wide receiver. Unfortunately, the 165 pounds is an awful BMI. While a lot of these things are at least somewhat easy to see on film or get into the right ballpark, we rarely ever have a good indication, at least that I know of how big a player's hands are. And so it is important to note that one important measurement for Worthy was that he had under 9-inch hands. For a player who struggled at the point of attack, at the catch point, and with drops, the under 9-inch hands are at least a significant notation. That said, as I mentioned before, Xavier Worthy did break the combine record with a 4.21 40, and aside from that, he was 92nd percentile in the broad jump and 95th percentile in the vertical jump. Worthy in particular is probably a bit of a deeper conversation, and I go into him in a bit deeper of a conversation on episode 10, but the big thing with Worthy is that his freshman production is elite, and it got him through every threshold that he needed to ever get through. And if you're not aware of how a lot of these things work with some of these predictive measurements, once you hit the threshold, you're done. And I guess that's kind of my problem with Worthy here. Analytically, predictively, correlatively, whatever you want to call it. I understand why that happens, but it's also hard for me when someone doesn't come close to those thresholds their second 2 years to just say logically, well, he did it 2 years ago, so I'm not going to be worried about anything else. While Xavier Worthy did get right over 1,000 yards in his third year, it wasn't a very impressive year overall, and in the last 2 years of his career, he only had 3 100-yard games. I really do hesitate to make this argument sometimes because I hate to spin positives as negatives, and I hate when other people do that. But when I see a player run a 4.21 and only have 300-yard games at the Big 12, I ask myself almost more so, how did you not have more big games? Specifically concerning for Xavier Worthy was that he stopped being able to produce at all on downfield passes. He was only able to produce on short passes and as a yards after catch receiver. Maybe this was a Texas quarterback issue, but he also played with 3 different Texas quarterbacks during his time there because of the injuries to the starting Texas quarterback, and none of them really made Xavier Worthy work downfield. So despite the fact that Xavier Worthy, when you look at any threshold, when you look at any number that's going to be considered predictive, he's going to score very highly in production. I have concerns with his production because this is why I say this isn't a threshold show. This is a different kind of show, and to me, the threshold hitting as a freshman and then being kind of lackluster the last 2 years, that scares me a bit. And as much as the 4.21 40 is impressive, being specifically under a 4.3 has never actually been seen to be like a positive thing for a wide receiver. I mean, how many of the best wide receivers have ran a sub 4.3? So I just don't know what to make of Xavier Worthy. There are a lot of positives, but to me, I prefer profiles that look, say, like Jalen Polk when there's conflict. I like to see maybe some missing check boxes, but a lot of check boxes in general, and maybe not a ton of upside things. I don't like seeing profiles like Xavier Worthy that have a lot of, say, upside green flags, but also have red flags all over the profile. So to me, the concerns at the physical point of attack, the concerns with the physical play, the concerns with catching the ball down the field, and the fact that I don't actually rate a 4.21 that highly in a vacuum, Xavier Worthy finds himself at wide receiver 11 in the middle of my Tier 3B. Up next, the end of Tier 3B, wide receiver 12, Malik Washington of Virginia. Malik Washington is 23 years, 8 months old as of September 1st. He is 5'8" and 1/2 inch, which is obviously very small for a wide receiver, but he has 30 3/8 inch arms and is 191 pounds. So when you look at the arm length and the weight side of those things, he's much closer to both, say, Ladd McConkey and Roman Wilson. He also weighs more than Roman Wilson, Ladd McConkey, and obviously Xavier Worthy as well. So while Malik Washington is a shorter wide receiver, he definitely has a couple of other physical things going his way in the profile. He did run a 4.47 in the 40, which I think at his height some people would hope would be a little bit faster, but when you consider that 191 pounds, his BMI is actually fairly high, that's a pretty good number. On top of that, he had a 42.5-inch vertical jump for 98th percentile and was 79th percentile in the broad jump. Aside from the physical concerns with the height, Malik Washington is another one of these wide receivers whose biggest concern is probably the early production, because his first 3 years are a massive red flag. Now, Northwestern is not generally a good environment to, say, put up high-end production as a player at college football. In the college football level, you're both not being supported by a ton, and you're playing in the Big Ten, which is a very difficult league to play in. But there's also some other things going on beyond just the normal Northwestern stuff for Malik Washington during these first 3 years, specifically the fact that COVID happens in the middle of these three. It's also important to note that in year 3, he had a ridiculously low passing offense. While there were a few quarterbacks used in that 2021 season, not a single one broke through 1,000 passing yards. 1,000 passing yards. So Malik Washington does have viable excuses, at least to an extent, when it comes to these production things. But the most important thing that excuses, for lack of a better term, his early production is how good his peak production is. Now, we're not there yet, because I think it's important to note that year 4 was not a bad season. In year 4, he did only have 694 receiving yards, but that is in an offense that only had about 2,500 passing yards and was 1-11 as a team. The proportion there is 27%, which is better than a lot of peak seasons that are ranked higher than Malik Washington, let alone second best seasons. Now, again, I'd rather see a little bit more volume, even if we're using the proportional excuse, but there is a factor in the whole reason we do this is the fact that 2,500 yards in an offense is a very small number. And then year 5 is basically the best peak season on this list. I don't know if that's 100% true, but if you take age out of the equation, I think maybe Malik Nabers, maybe Marvin Harrison Jr. are the only ones who are close. And that's only because the ACC I rank slightly below the Big Ten and SEC. In his year 5, he has 110 receptions on a team that only has 248 completions. That's 44.4%. He has 1,426 receiving yards on a team that only throws for a little over 3,000. That's 47.4%. And he has 9 touchdowns on a team that only throws for 19, which is exactly the same as his receiving at 47.4%. So these are amazing numbers. A lot of these other players are at, like, say, 25, and we're hoping they get to 30. He's in the mid-40s, okay? So this is an insane peak season for Malik Washington. So the bottom line with Malik Washington is that while he does have size concerns, even his size, on the way I calculate size, using the size triangle that I've talked about before on this show, that highlights weight and arm length as equal to height, he fares much better within this methodology. And then on top of that, his early production is very poor, but the peak production is elite. So considering production in particular is the way we look for fantasy upside, at least in my opinion, I see Malik Washington, despite the height, as a player who has a lot of fantasy upside. In a lot of ways, it would feel like lightning striking twice if a player who does in many ways profile like Tank Dell, kind of in an eerie way, ended up being good with all the concerns that are still in that profile. And he is my wide receiver 12, which is fairly far down my list for a reason. But at the end of the day, outside of the height and the early production, which are both things I'm willing to get over for the reasons I've explained, Malik Washington has a lot to like as a guy who might have some sneaky upside for fantasy football leagues. So now we're getting into my last 3 truly ranked receivers, my Tier 3C. The reason we're still calling this all Tier 3 is that it is all pretty close, but this is another slight step down for me. Up first, I have Ricky Pearsall, the wide receiver from Florida, at wide receiver 13. Now, Ricky Pearsall is 24 years old as of September 1st, so that's very old for a wide receiver prospect. He is 6'1", 189 pounds with 30 7/8" arms, but most importantly, Ricky Pearsall is probably the biggest combine riser for me, because obviously risers after the combine have to be somewhat based on expectations. Ladd McConkey and Xavier Worthy, did they run faster than I was expecting them to? Yes, but I thought they were both fast, and I wasn't someone who thought that Ladd McConkey was a 4.6 guy. I probably thought he was probably a 4.45 guy instead of a 4.39, about a half a tenth difference there. But Ladd McConkey, Xavier Worthy, I didn't really move them up that much. I already thought they were fast. Ricky Pearsall showing both the explosion of the 88th percentile broad and the 97th percentile vert, and the shuttle and 3-cone stats for the agility drills with a 93rd percentile 3-cone and an 89th percentile short shuttle were both very impressive. I have been low on Ricky Pearsall, and more than any other profile for a player I've come around on a bit, my early profiles on Ricky Pearsall are fairly negative to completely negative, but he is a player who's obviously rising for me at this point. Even when I didn't love Ricky Pearsall, I did have a specific comp for Ricky Pearsall right away. It was one of my favorite ones that I nailed on a player right away, and the high testing 3-cone actually fits into it quite well, which is Greg Jennings. And Greg Jennings is a player who fits into a lot of things with Ricky Pearsall well, as a kind of taller but mostly power slot wide receiver. Now, Ricky Pearsall did have very poor early production, but maybe some of that is the same as the early concerns that Jayden Daniels had with the lack of progression that he got out of an Arizona team that was pretty dysfunctional. My bigger concern, though, was that I wasn't really that impressed with the production in Ricky Pearsall's peak season. This past season, even though the numbers on paper looked a bit better, I did find that he was beating up on some of the lesser teams, and even the games, say against Georgia, where he had good production, a lot of that production was reserved until the game was thoroughly out of hand, and so I don't really give him a ton of credit for playing well against Georgia because it wasn't really in the competitive play portion of the game. These are the things I first hammered home when I talked about Ricky Pearsall, and I still believe in them all. But when you look at the way he's tested, when you look at the way he's impressed people in these neutral environments, at this point, in the same kind of way that Ladd McConkey and Roman Wilson are these kind of flyers that haven't really had the season we look for, and also don't really fit the mold of, say, what we used to look for with flyers, that they all need to look like DK Metcalf, I still like the idea that these guys are some projectable high upside players and have some upside in volume roles. So Ricky Pearsall, my wide receiver 13. Up next, Malachi Corley, my wide receiver 14 out of Western Kentucky. I hope I'm not moving him too much because I do believe he had a combine illness, which is why he didn't participate, and that is an event I thought he would light up. And so at 22 years, 4 months, as of September 1st, 5'11", 215 pounds, 32-inch arms, there's a lot to like there. I think it would be maybe harder for him to be, say, under Ricky Pearsall if I was staring down his combine measurements. That said, as a player that I think has some flaws, but some excitement, maybe the lack of a combine will keep his buzz down and make him easier to get at a good price in fantasy leagues. The big flaw that I'm referring to is the fact that Malachi Corley, despite playing in a fairly low, in fact very low level of competition, in the worst conference, in my opinion, in the FBS, Malachi Corley was used in an extremely limited role as a low ADOT receiver who basically worked in the short underneath and yards after catch game more exclusively. While the YAC profile is interesting, Debo neither at South Carolina nor in the NFL is nearly as limited as Malachi Corley has shown to be, at least in my opinion, at the Conference USA level. Now, you can easily say maybe that's just the way his team wants to use him, but it's hard to project a player to be used in a more expansive role in the NFL than what they were asked to do in Conference USA. Ultimately, for all the Debo comparisons, I think when you look at his size, he's kind of a midpoint between Wan'Dale Robinson and Laviska Shenault, and I actually think there's a lot of similarities there. I don't think that necessarily means he's not going to be a good receiver. I think there were opportunities for those guys to show things to the next level. But at the end of the day, those are comparisons I think fit a lot better with the profile with Malachi Corley. So finally for Tier 3C, my last wide receiver that's going to have a ranked number by their name, wide receiver 15, Xavier Legette of South Carolina. Xavier Legette is 23 years, 7 months as of September 1st, 6'1", 221 pounds, which is a very nice measurement there, 31 7/8 inch arms. The only technically negative thing you can say is that he was listed at 6'3", so 6'1" is a bit of a disappointment, but I don't really care about that. Xavier Legette tested out at 4.39 on the 40, 90th percentile on the vertical, and 79th percentile on the broad jump, all of these being very excellent measurements. The big thing though about Xavier Legette is poor early production has been said on this show 5, 10, 15 times maybe, but no player is as bad as Xavier Legette. Xavier Legette's first 3 seasons sound like games. 9 for 80 and a touchdown, 7 for 113, and 8 for 63 and a touchdown. Now there were some on-field things, there were some off-field things that went into some, in terms of personal life losses, that went into Xavier Legette not breaking out, depending on who you ask. But in my opinion, these 3 seasons, combined with a 4th season where he had 18 receptions, 167 yards, and 3 touchdowns, which is better, but not that much better, these 4 seasons are so bad that there's really no combination of excuses that can get me past the idea that Xavier Legette you would want to see produce better. And then to me, when you break down his breakout a little bit more, it's more good than great. It looks great because you get to say 1,255 yards in the SEC, but to begin, just because you're playing an SEC schedule doesn't mean you put up 1,255 yards in the SEC, specifically when you're putting up things like, say, almost 300 yards against Jacksonville State, when you're putting up 150 yards against a team that's still in the FCS this year. That's not putting up those numbers against the SEC. And then on top of it, the 2 biggest games he had against the SEC itself were against Vanderbilt and Mississippi State. And they were the biggest games substantially. And Vanderbilt and Mississippi State, they combined last year for a 1-15 conference record. So while it is a factual statement to say Xavier Legette played an SEC schedule and Xavier Legette had 1,255 yards playing an SEC schedule, the scheduling adjusting, looking at, say, the difficulty of the competition level compared to the amount of numbers he's putting up, Xavier Legette was really kicking the crap out of the worst teams and not really putting out the best numbers against the harder competition levels. So bottom line, I talk about this just a little bit more in show 14, but Legette is a player I'm coming around on for the physical upside, but I still have a problem building a profile based specifically on physical upside. There's things that are not purely physical with Xavier Legette. There's things with liking him in point of attack and separation ways, but even those are still mostly based on physicality. So wide receiver 15, that's kind of the range I'm willing to put a player that I'm very confident has the kind of physicality I'm looking for, but I'm not confident at all has the football skills I'm looking for. So that is all for my ranked players in terms of the big board. Like I said on the last show, the big board, the goal of the big board is to not have too many, if any, players that go on day 3 ranked on the big board. So if you're keeping track, that means most likely the first 7 quarterbacks, the first 6 running backs, and the first 15 wide receivers, as well as the top 2 tight ends, are going to be the top 30 for my big board. These are also going to be the 30 projections I have to be day 2 draft picks. Now for the honorable mentions, I'm going to go mostly alphabetically. And what I mean by mostly alphabetically is I have split them up into 2 groups. So the first 6 are all above the second 6, but within those groups of 6, they're all alphabetical. So going into the top tier, the first tier, the honorable A's, the honorable mention A's, going into Javon Baker, the wide receiver of Central Florida. Now, Javon Baker, he's a truly late breakout because Javon Baker didn't really break out until the back half of the 2023 season. His physicality is very intriguing, but I think a lot of numbers that you'll see pop up on Twitter about Javon Baker are influenced by a run-heavy offense in a way that doesn't really get stated, especially by the people tweeting those numbers. And I think a run-heavy offense, the likes of which Central Florida runs, creates skews that people don't really account for sometimes in their numbers. For a practical example of this, there's a play that Javon Baker breaks in one of the later games of the season that's this huge touchdown that occurs when the safety and corner on his side of the ball blitz. Now, I'm not sure if this was a miscommunication or just an overload to stop the run, but they're able to not run the ball and pitch the ball out to Javon Baker for a very easy touchdown. And on top of the fact that the play itself is simple and easy, when you're not throwing that many passing yards, that has now become a proportionally better play for the player. And so I guess that's my point with the rushing offenses. Busted plays happen more often against rushing offenses, and busted plays create a higher proportion of your team's total passing yards when you're on one of these rushing offenses. So Javon Baker having these big busted plays, that doesn't impress me statistically. So Javon Baker, he's in the honorable A's for a reason. He's a player that there are some things I like, but I don't think almost anything that gets brought up about him statistically impresses me as much as, say, a lot of other people. Jermaine Burton, the wide receiver out of Alabama. Maybe this isn't fair to Jermaine Burton, but it seems like a lot of the conversation about Jermaine Burton gives him an excuse for this year and his overall numbers because he was playing with Jalen Milroe, who's a run-first quarterback. But I have a hard time getting over the fact that in his third year, in the year that's supposed to be the prominent year that people go to the NFL off of, and in a year that he was transferring to Alabama to specifically be a big part of the offense, he really did nothing with reigning Heisman Trophy winner Bryce Young. Now look, I get it. Bryce Young's not playing well in the NFL right now, but the dude won a Heisman, okay? He was a pretty good SEC quarterback, and I just have a hard time with what Jermaine Burton did not do in that offense. That said, he is a physically gifted wide receiver whose name has been around in these circles for a long time for a reason. Up next, going from the big school to the small school, I have Jalen Coker, the wide receiver out of Holy Cross. This is a player I need to watch a lot more of. Almost every player who plays FBS football, I at least have a borderline exposure to, because I watch all the FBS games, even the really bad ones on Tuesday and Wednesday, Thursday night, or at least what you guys probably think are really bad ones. But Holy Cross doesn't even play in those games because Holy Cross is not an FBS school. So Jalen Coker, I need to watch him a bit more. I need to find a bit more of his tape to watch. But the traits that I see associated with Jalen Coker are ones that are very intriguing to me. They're the kind of things that I like to look for in these FCS wide receivers, especially for upside. And the things he's not as good at, the negatives, say like his 40 time, aren't things I really get hung up on that much. So Jalen Coker's positives sound interesting to me. Jalen Coker's negatives don't really bother me. And so for a guy that I don't really know much about, I have Jalen Coker in tier A of the honorable mentions. Up next, I once said that I prefer Jalen McMillan of Washington to Ricky Pearsall, and I'm clearly not there anymore, but Jalen McMillan of Washington is still a wide receiver I like a lot for his ability to do underneath things. Now, whereas Ricky Pearsall's comp right now is in the Greg Jennings, and there is some more upside in that comparison probably, I do think it's a fair comparison between Jalen McMillan and someone like, say, Tyler Boyd. And if you got that kind of season or career from a player drafted this lowly, or presumably drafted this lowly, that would be a great outcome. So Jalen McMillan, a player that I don't really think plays outside a ton. I think that is kind of the hang up here. But I do see the potential for him to translate as, say, a Tyler Boyd type player. Up next, I have Tez Walker, maybe one of my bigger controversies against consensus. I do think there's a lot of upside with Tez Walker from North Carolina, but athletically, I see him a lot more as being a one-note player, a very linear player. Maybe that's just what he was asked to do, but in the situations this offseason where he's been taken out of his comfort zone, he hasn't really done very well. He had probably some of the worst buzz coming out of the Senior Bowl, which isn't a big deal, but it is a big deal when I don't have much to go on at you playing Power 5 football. Not entirely his fault. He should have played for more of the season. He should have played for the entire season without the NCAA being kind of dumb about it. But Tez Walker only had about 2/3 of a season this year, or half a season, whatever it was, in the Power 5 level. Before that, he was playing in the MAC. So there are things to like with Tez Walker. I'm just a little worried, again, about that kind of linear nature. Johnny Wilson, the wide receiver from Florida State, is going to round out the first tier of honorable mentions. I wanted to play a tight end because all the inconsistencies I would love to not have to worry about at the tight end position. Because at least for fantasy, I wouldn't have to worry about those, because if he was an inconsistent receiver, that's still a pretty good fantasy tight end. That said, as much as Wilson is inconsistent, as the tight end conversation suggests, he is huge. He has size that is very legit. Out of all these players that get written about as being 6'4", and end up coming to the combine and being 6'2", 6'2.5", 6'3", Johnny Wilson was one of those where you looked at it after the combine and you were like, this is the official one? The 6'6" with 36-inch arms? That's the official one? Okay. Yeah, that's a very big wide receiver. I think I rounded up both those numbers, but I didn't round up by much, and that's how big Johnny Wilson is. And then finally, my last tier, my honorable mention 2 tier, starting with Jacob Cowing of Arizona. Now, Jacob Cowing does have size red flags. They are not similar to Malik Washington's in the sense that Malik Washington weighs more, has longer arms. That kind of puts it, separates them a little bit from the pure size perspective. But my bigger issue with Jacob Cowing is the fact that a lot of the numbers people look at with Jacob Cowing and talk about over the course of Jacob Cowing's career are centered around his UTEP career and not his Arizona career. And if you only look at his Arizona career, the numbers are fine, but they don't hit any of the thresholds we look for. And so to me, and like all analogies, this is fairly imperfect, but it kind of reminds me, as someone who did baseball scouting before football scouting, of watching a player do well in AA, promoting him to AAA, and then seeing him struggle a lot more, and then going, well, I don't care that he got figured out a little bit in AAA. He played pretty good in AA. I think this guy's going to be good. And sometimes baseball levels don't work that linearly, but in general, you're looking for guys that move up levels and play well, not move up levels and don't hit thresholds anymore. So that's kind of my bottom line with Jacob Cowing, is that he's an undersized player who the Pac-12 competition levels seem to knock him down a peg. I have Luke McCaffrey on this list. He has shown some flashes since transitioning to wide receiver full time, just not necessarily enough for me on this list. I also have Brendan Rice. He did not quite test as well as I think a lot of people were expecting, but in general, he still is an intriguing speed size threat because he has very good length and size for downfield receptions. That said, a player who does not have very good size is Ainias Smith of Texas A&M. Ainias Smith is one of those players where I just struggle to see a fantasy future. There's some things on the field that I really like about Ainias Smith, but he's just so small. He's so narrow. He has such small hands. Ainias Smith's a player I like. He's just a player that I'm more interested to see, say, go to my favorite NFL team than draft on my fantasy team. Next up, Jamari Thrash. Jamari Thrash, I think, is solid. I think he just lacks some explosiveness. I try to do as good a job as possible at communicating the exact things I like and do not like about a player. But Jamari Thrash I'm just going to fail with that because Jamari Thrash is one of those players I just watch, and everything about him just says to me, this is a very good college wide receiver. I don't think he's better than that, but I think he's a very good college wide receiver. And so that's just kind of how I feel about Jamari Thrash. Might end up being off about that, but he's just a very solid wide receiver that I don't see being a guy at the next level. And so finally, very last honorable mention here, Taj Washington, the other Washington of USC. Now, similarly to Ainias, similarly to Cowing, very narrow, extremely small hands. In fact, I think Taj Washington does have the worst size overall. 9th percentile height, 4th percentile weight, 2nd percentile arm length, and 3rd percentile hand size. So his 5'9" and 3/4 inch height measurement is his best measurement by far. That's the gold star that he has, is the 5'9" and 3/4. Everything else is worse. Now, he was ultimately very good, at least on his explosive plays in 2023, but it was a 5th-year senior season. It wasn't quite enough, and so, it's a good season, not a great or spectacular season compared to, say, Malik Washington. And then all these other things that kind of assuage some of my doubts for the shorter Malik Washington, those really aren't there with Taj Washington. Same with Ainias Smith, same with Cowing. So I myself think that I might be grading these players a little too differently between Malik Washington and the other 3 smaller wide receivers, but right now I don't see them as similarly. I would grade one of them, Malik Washington, as a day 2 player. I would grade the other 3 between day 3 and UDFA. So Malik Washington, a player I like a lot. Taj Washington, a player I'm pretty hesitant about. And so to very quickly recap my 2024 wide receiver rankings with my tiers, starting with tier 1, Marvin Harrison, wide receiver 1. Wide receiver 2, Malik Nabers. Wide receiver 3, Rome Odunze. Then going into tier 2, starting with A.D. Mitchell at wide receiver 4. Wide receiver 5, Troy Franklin. Wide receiver 6, Keon Coleman. Wide receiver 7, Brian Thomas Jr. And then that leads me into tier 3, starting with tier 3A, Jalen Polk. Then Roman Wilson at wide receiver 9. And then tier 3B, starting with Lad McConkey at wide receiver 10. Wide receiver 11, Xavier Worthy. Wide receiver 12, Malik Washington. And that leads me into tier 3C with Ricky Pearsall at wide receiver 13, Malachi Corley at wide receiver 14, and Xavier Legette at wide receiver 15. I also have 12 honorable mentions split up into 2 tiers, starting with honorable mention A's, which are Javon Baker, Jermaine Burton, Jalen Coker, Jalen McMillan, Tez Walker, and Johnny Wilson. And then the second tier of honorable mentions with Jacob Cowing, Luke McCaffrey, Brendan Rice, Ainias Smith, Jamari Thrash, and Taj Washington. And so with that is all I have for the rankings. I will take a short break and then get into some quick end notes. One last note before I get into my end notes, I'd like to thank everybody once again for listening to the show. It means a lot to me. I'd like to encourage everybody to just remember to listen next week. Next week I'm going to go over my big board. The big thing that's going to be different between what I've done the last 3 weeks and the big board is that the big board is going to focus a little bit more on historical context. So to avoid saying too many things multiple times, I'm going to bring in a lot more players from other classes to contextualize this class with the big board show next week. The big board will rank my 31 players that I have a day 2 grade on. So into the end notes and the end of the show. So most of the show was recorded a little bit before this last week, but on Thursday or Friday, The Athletic released, or at least the Athletic Football Show podcast, released their show on the wide receivers. And so I wanted to listen to some of that for some thoughts from Robert Mays, Dane Brugler, and Nate Tice. Not everything that I'm about to say goes into that, but that is, I waited to listen to that before I recorded these end notes. So just for this show itself, I was thinking a little bit what I was saying about the ceiling and the floor, comparing the top 3 wide receivers in this class to the Jalen Waddle, Jamar Chase, Devontae Smith trio in that class. And I think the only thing I can think of after thinking about it for like maybe a week is that those 3 are SEC, 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 and these 3 are SEC, Big Ten, Pac. And the Pac in particular is a weaker conference from a talent-based perspective from these defensive players and cornerbacks. So for Rome in particular, you could say that that's particularly a risk, but that to be clear, that's not one that concerns me. I'm just trying to find something that even suggests that the floor isn't very high for these 3 players. This is also a very small note, but it's also one of my own pet peeves. I hate when I hear people say listed measurements after the combine when we know that they're not true. And I said that Marvin Harrison Jr. was 6'4", when he's technically not 6'4". He's like 6'3", but that doesn't really matter. I just want to say that because I did say the listed height. One intriguing note that was on the Athletic Football Show in regard to Brian Thomas Jr. was that they mentioned that their perspective was that his route running improved, or at least one of their perspectives was that his route running improved from September to October to November. And that is obviously both a learning curve and also an endpoint. If the endpoint's that much better, really, in November and in the bowl, that's something that's very intriguing. Brian Thomas Jr. is still my wide receiver 7, but like I said, with that tier, the wide receiver 4 to 7 is very close to me, and it's probably going to come down in that tier to landing spots and draft capital. I do like Brian Thomas Jr. a good amount, and I think basically the way I see the board right now, whoever I put at 4 is going to feel too high, and whoever I put at 7 is too low. The way I'm kind of leaning right now does push Brian Thomas Jr. below a couple of these guys, which is a little bit controversial, but I still like him basically just as much as the 3 guys in front of him. It's interesting because I knew Xavier Worthy was going to be a well-liked prospect, at least by some people, for a long time, because you know how production models are going to work, and production models were set for Xavier Worthy after his freshman year. And then between that and just the fact that you knew he was going to run fast, even if you didn't think he was going to run a 4.21, you knew at least some people were going to be very in on Xavier Worthy. And for a while now, I've known that if Xavier Worthy didn't show me some different things in 2023, I'd probably be lower on him than most people, and he'd be the guy I'd be kind of afraid of ranking too low, and that would make me look bad. And interestingly enough, and you kind of see this in the fact that these 2 are ranked 10 and 11, and this player's ahead of him, the player I'm worried about the most is actually Ladd McConkey. I think when it comes to the perspective from the Athletic Football Show, the thing that was really stressed with Ladd McConkey is the idea that so many people in a controversial class like Ladd McConkey. Now, to be fair, Dane Brugler did mention both the size and the chronic injuries as negatives for Ladd McConkey, and those are ones discussed a lot here. But I guess most importantly to me, the whole reason that we use production in general, not even for this position where it's very important specifically for this position to use production, is to keep us honest. To me, the reason proportional production is so important is that it just shows us generally how much our team is passing and how much is available to us. And Ladd McConkey didn't get a lot of what was available. On top of that, whether it is his fault or not, he didn't have the big game performances, and that's the real thing that's hard for me. Yes, it is kind of silly and arbitrary to focus so much on some of these real small things, but you want to see wide receivers take over games and be the reason their team wins. We can look at a player like Keon Coleman on paper, and maybe people will disagree with me on this. This is very subjective, but I would argue that Keon Coleman, even this past year, where he on paper didn't have a whole lot of stats for Florida State, I would argue he was a more essential part of Florida State going 13-0 before the bowl season than Ladd McConkey was, maybe even in any individual victory in Georgia's 2-year title stretch. Georgia's played in very few close games. I can think of them. I can count them. The Auburn game this year, the Ohio State game last year, the Alabama SEC championship game this year. Ladd McConkey doesn't have great numbers in any of them. I don't like arbitrary numbers for the fact that they're arbitrary numbers, but I use 100-yard games because 100-yard games is 100 yards is a low number. 100 yards is not a lot. Ladd McConkey had 100 yards twice in his college football career. And I guess for me, there's just a big disconnect between the idea that this guy is a game breaker. Like, that's the way people talk about him. This guy is such a good route runner that he is a game breaker. And a guy who's a game breaker on a team that threw 4,000 yards a season barely had impact games, like ever. And so there's just a disconnect to me there with everything that's going on. People say things like, well, you're not watching the film enough. No, I see everything. I see I can use all the same adjectives that everybody else uses. But at the end of the day, the disconnect there, it doesn't fit to me. Maybe he should be my wide receiver 8, not my wide receiver 10, but I'm not going to move him into that wide receiver 4 through 7 tier right now. Not for me, not right now, not with Ladd McConkey just yet, but he is the player I'm most worried about being wrong on. I also thought it was interesting that Dane Brugler was asked who his favorite wide receiver was outside the top 2 rounds, and they did say 2 rounds, not 2 days. Maybe there was a miscommunication there. But he said Malik Washington, the wide receiver from Virginia. I didn't even necessarily know yet. Maybe I did. I can't remember. That Dane Brugler was very high on Malik Washington. But Malik Washington, obviously, in my top 12, in the same tier as Ladd McConkey and Xavier Worthy. So I like that shout out quite a bit. I didn't really think I was going to make any notes about my honorable mentions, but I did want to note that Dane Brugler and Rick Spielman, which are very different sources, at least the way I view sources, they've both pointed out on different shows that I've listened to that Jalen McMillan, they've had a play strength problem with in his translation to the next level. So, Jalen McMillan's already not in my day 2 grades yet, but that is just something that I just thought was noteworthy just because it was so specific. So when you hear the exact same specific reason from 2 different sources like this that are fairly separate, different networks, I don't know if they have any connection that I'm not aware of, but when you see 2 different people saying something that specific about the reason they're not putting a guy with a day 2 grade, that's just something to keep an eye on for me. And I guess just because I am on the subject of honorable mentions, I did go through a couple of the lists, including the Combine invitees list, and I was trying to think to myself, out of all the players that aren't on this show, does any name stick out? And if I had to say the name that sticks out to me, it would be Bub Means, the wide receiver from Pittsburgh. And if I had to do it again, I might switch him with Jamari Thrash. I've been thinking about the Jamari Thrash thing a little bit too, and I wonder if it's just a lack of explosiveness that I'm not seeing on tape. Because that's the Jamari Thrash player I said I struggle the most with figuring out why I don't like him as much. And I made a spreadsheet, if I haven't mentioned that. There is a spreadsheet available for all my rankings. I have posted on Reddit. It should be on the comments for the Substack. And if it's not on the comments on the Substack, you can email me at cjfreel@gmail.com. But anyway, as I'm building out this spreadsheet, I realized Jamari Thrash, or at least more realized, Jamari Thrash's jumps were fairly poor at the Combine. So that kind of made me think about it and maybe contextualize it a little bit better in my head, that maybe what I was seeing and saying when I was saying that Jamari Thrash really strikes me on film as a very good college wide receiver as a ceiling, that might be just kind of a lack of explosiveness going on there. So Bub Means, though, the 28th wide receiver on this show. And so with all that said, that is all I have for this show today. It's been one of my longest shows, and I basically only talked about wide receivers. So Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll be doing the big board next week. Like I mentioned in the little advertisement break, the big board's focus will be on taking past prospects to compare it to this class so that we can, just see how this class stacks up, at least in my personal grades going into the draft over the last few years. But until then, this has been Fantasy for Real. I am CJ For Real, and I will see you next time.